Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Welcome to Hong Kong Confidential. I'm Jules Hannaford and I'm your host. I'm an Australian woman and I've been living in Hong Kong for many years. I'm a mother, a teacher, an author, and I want to share my wisdom and the wisdom of others with you. Thanks for joining me and I hope you enjoy the show.
You meet someone online and there's this instant connection. It's amazing how much the two of you just seem to click. They live somewhere far away and there's some plausible reason they can't travel to meet you. They tell you they're in love with you and you feel optimistic for the first time in a long time. They have a successful career, yet somehow they need money from you to solve a short-term problem, always with the promise of paying you back. Time goes on and they need more money more urgently. You've started to see the cracks and begin to wonder whether they've been lying this whole time. All of a sudden it hits you. You've been scammed. Fool Me Twice is the story of my mother, Jules Hannaford, a woman who was drawn into the dangerous world of sweetheart scams. After a trip overseas to meet a stranger, a dangerous altercation in a Manchester hotel room, and thousands of pounds lost for good, she's here to tell her story. Fool Me Twice, a true crime podcast, will be available on all podcast platforms in late 2019.
Today I'm here with Minal Mahtani. Hi Minal, thank you for joining me today.
Hi Jules, it's a pleasure to be here today.
Minal, you are the CEO and founder of the OCD and Anxiety Support in Hong Kong. How did you come to create this service?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I actually was in a really bad place with physical illness. I was experiencing chronic pain and had problems swallowing. At that time, when the body gives way, the mind goes down with it. Started to make me feel quite depressed. I didn't suffer from depression, but I just felt like, what's wrong with me? Why can't I help myself with this? And why is it taking so long? And why me? And all those questions got me to look into support group services in Hong Kong for those who are struggling with stress, anxiety, depression, or OCD, and there was nothing. I know that I continued to research and found there were a lack of English-speaking psychiatrists and psychologists in Hong Kong. In terms of support services that are available, if you want to see a psychologist and go under private care, it costs anywhere from $1,800 to $3,000 per session.
It's so expensive, isn't it?
It's not, considering how many people are suffering from mental illness. And a psychiatrist as well, the price is even higher. And if you go through the public healthcare system, that takes anywhere from 12 to 18 months to get an appointment. And when you do get an appointment, you're given 5 to 7 minutes.
What?
That's the average time that you spend with your psychologist or psychiatrist. And their first method of treatment is medication.
I had no idea that the meetings were so short and they went straight to medication. That's so interesting.
Yeah, I don't think they have time to delve into what the cause of their issue is, where it's coming from, or even working on challenging or reframing those thoughts or adapting those behaviors and beliefs. And so medication is the way that they work. I was really inspired at that time where I was feeling very low physically to create. And I think that's the time where a lot of people create when they're actually going through a bad phase themselves. And I said, okay, I've been a teacher for 8 years, which I love doing. I worked at ESF, another international school. Loved watching children grow, learn, foster curiosity. But there was a huge calling to get trained and become a cognitive behavior therapist and work with those who are suffering from mental illness.
You have a bit of a focus on OCD and anxiety particularly. Why is that? Why did you choose those areas?
Okay, well, I struggled with an anxiety disorder. I struggled with an anxiety disorder about 10 years ago, and this was not related to why I had that sudden shift at that time. But when I struggled with an anxiety disorder, it came after I lost 3 family members in a span of 6 months. I was about 28 years old at the time. After seeing a lot of death in the family, it made me very worried, made me very anxious, and made me think of, when's the next person going to die? Who's it going to be? Every time the phone rang and it was past 10 o'clock, I would just be startled and worried. I think my fear of death really stemmed from a young girl. I remember being 4 years old watching a movie with my aunt. It was an Indian movie and a lady was shot and she was wearing a white sari and her entire sari was filled with blood. And my immediate reaction was to throw up all over her carpet. And I was shivering so intensely. I think anxiety has always been something that I had, but the way we got around it as a teenager and in my early 20s was, let's just not talk about death around Minal. Let's avoid it. And when she gets worried, I think with my parents, it was, let's give her the reassurance that everything's going to be okay, as opposed to letting me face it, go through the fear, challenge the belief that death is scary. When I went through my anxiety disorder about 10 years ago and kind of was face to face with death, that's what made me realize that I had to face my fear and work through the fear that I had. Hence, I can relate to those who are struggling with anxiety disorders. And with OCD, I have a family member who suffers from OCD and she's been suffering with it for about 40 years now. The earlier days as well, there were not enough trained cognitive behavior therapists or people with any real understanding of OCD. They just thought she was crazy and they didn't really understand why she felt the need to wash her hands and use countless bars of soap. They wanted to send her into, kind of call it an asylum at the time. To me, it just made me really sad. And what I know today of OCD and how there's so many misconceptions around it, I really wanted to have the opportunity to debunk some of those and to help that overlooked but really important part of the mental health community.
Yeah, that's really amazing. She wasn't diagnosed when she was younger. It wasn't till much later.
Yes. And even when she was diagnosed, I think it was all with medication. I mean, normally it takes about 10 to 12 years after one is experiencing symptoms to be diagnosed with OCD.
That's such a long time.
I think a lot of that comes from fear of stigma, people really worrying about what others are going to think about them, judge them, label them as peculiar, weird, and also a lack of education on what the different mental health disorders are.
People actually develop skills to mask their OCD, don't they? So people don't necessarily see it or recognize it. Some people can hide it, can't they?
Absolutely. I think people who can, it takes a tremendous amount of strength to be able to cover the compulsions, the rituals that one needs to do if they have OCD. And those rituals are performed to try and temporarily relieve the anxiety and take them away from the thought that they're having that makes it so scary for them to live. But those compulsions in time actually make the disorder worse. I think people who have more physical compulsions, such as hand washing or doing a particular body movement or repeating coming in and out of the room or checking, they find it harder to conceal. But with some types of OCD, like pure OCD, there's a lot of compulsions that are done in the mind.
Yes, like counting and things like that can be just so people wouldn't know that you're doing it.
Absolutely.
You mentioned about debunking some of the myths around OCD. What are some of these myths?
People who struggle with OCD are often seen as being so particular about cleanliness, about wanting things to be in the perfect order, to be very precise in the way they actually conduct their activities. People just believe that it's a quirk. It's something in their personality that makes them want things to be exactly the way they are. But with OCD, it's so much more than that. OCD is obsessive compulsive disorder. Obsessions are the thoughts that one has in their minds that repeat like a broken tape recorder. Compulsions are the rituals that are done to temporarily relieve anxiety. With OCD, if one does not do those compulsions, they feel like they're in a state of distress, they feel extreme fear and anxiety and that something terrible will happen to themselves or their family. It actually disrupts daily living. So I have worked with clients, adults and teenagers who, because of their nature of their OCD, they've spent so much time in rituals that they're not able to leave their house or go to work or even have a shower in some cases because they are so preoccupied with their obsessions, their thoughts that take over their mind and their space.
How might you treat somebody with OCD? There's a form of kind of immersion therapy, or what is it called?
Exposure response therapy.
That's it. Sorry, that's what I was looking for. Not immersion, but exposure response. So you're literally exposing them to the rituals that they have or the fears that they have to try and get things under control. Is that right?
Absolutely. The two main ways of treating OCD are through therapy, and the type of therapy is cognitive behavior therapy. The cognitive is working with a person's thoughts, their irrational beliefs, their negative patterns of thinking. Maybe a person believes that they are going to harm their girlfriend, and they have that thought over and over again in their mind, and they have images of pushing her off the roof. So the compulsion for them would be to avoid maybe seeing the girlfriend with a few other people, not going anywhere where it's dangerous, where there is a height, where there are knives, where there's any sort of weapon that they could use to hurt their girlfriend. So the exposure response prevention would be to gradually expose them to what makes them scared. So if they're starting to avoid their girlfriend, we say, okay,
bring your girlfriend in.
Bring your girlfriend in. And if it's, I don't want to be with her alone, okay, well, let's see how long you can be with her alone. Let's just do it for 2 minutes and let your anxiety race and get to a 10 out of 10 and let you feel like you're not going to be able to actually cope with it. And in time, your anxiety will go down.
And then you recognize that you can cope with it.
Right. And nothing actually happened. It was just a thought. So just because you believe you're going to harm your girlfriend, what is the evidence? And that's the cognitive behavior therapy. Have you hurt your girlfriend before? Have you hurt anybody before? Just because you're having these thoughts are OCD thoughts, and OCD thoughts lie. They're like robbers and thieves that want to steal your joy.
Oh, that's a nice analogy.
Yeah. So it's exposing the person to what they fear the most in a slow, safe, and gradual way. Similarly, I had a client who was scared of contracting an illness and was scared of touching anything in public spaces, doorknobs, going into public toilets. For my client, I had to make him actually touch doorknobs and not wash his hands because he would avoid actually going through the door. He would wait for people to come and pass and open the door for him. And sometimes he'd be in places where he'd be waiting a long time, or he'd have to put on gloves and use them to open the door, or he'd have to use paper towels. We call those barriers to help you get through, which will relieve the anxiety and make him think, okay, I can't catch an illness. So the exposure response therapy would be getting them to touch different surfaces, obviously surfaces that are considered safe, and getting them not to wash after that. And it takes a lot of courage to be open to facing your fear and feeling those symptoms when you have anxiety, with your heart racing and sweating and feeling nauseous and feeling like you're going to die or lose control. The effects that your body go through with fight or flight are tremendous and can be very crippling. So I give a lot of credit to those who are brave enough to do that.
Yeah, I interviewed Lexi. She's on a previous episode, and she talked about her compulsions and the anxiety and the fear surrounding them, and about the exposure response therapy and how it really did work for her. She's only a teenager, and she's super brave for coming on the podcast and talking about her experience, but it was so interesting.
Absolutely. It takes a lot of courage. And I think speaking about what you're going through with your mental illness is the first step in changing perceptions about mental health.
What about anxiety? How does that impact people, and how do you treat them?
Okay, so I think it's important here to distinguish between anxiety and anxiety disorders.
Oh, okay. Yes,
tell me. There is a difference. Everybody goes through some level of anxiety, and that's a normal emotional response to a real or perceived threat. So if I know that I have an examination tomorrow or a presentation that I need to perform, I will feel anxious in some way. And anxiety could be some fear, some dread, some worry. That's anxiety. So it's common to all of us. It's universal. An anxiety disorder is different. It's actually when the anxiety gets so overwhelming and so extreme that it prevents you from actually engaging in daily activities and tasks, and it causes high levels of distress. So there are many different types of anxiety disorders. There's panic disorder, where people feel a high level of anxiety causing panic and they experience panic attacks. Maybe if they're in a closed space and they feel like they can't get out and they need cognitive behavior therapy again and exposure response prevention to help them with that. There's social anxiety disorder, which is a type of anxiety disorder, and phobia, where people are scared of social interaction. They worry about what others are going to think of them. So if I had social anxiety and I was speaking to you, I would worry about if you were evaluating me, judging me, what you were thinking of me, the expressions on my face were correct, if you were looking at my hairdo and judging it. I'd also be worried if I was saying something to offend you, and I'd be worried about hurting you. I'd also be carrying beliefs such as, she doesn't really like me, I have nothing interesting to offer, I'm so boring, why am I even here? So people who have social anxiety find it very difficult to actually engage and interact with society, which is really important for human development.
It's the cornerstone of our lives, isn't it? Relationships are the key.
Absolutely.
So not to be able to interact with people without having these thoughts must be so debilitating.
Absolutely. And connection actually produces oxytocin. And oxytocin is one of the happy chemicals in our brain that we need to feel good about ourselves and our lives. And one of the things we tell clients when they're struggling with depression, anxiety, and OCD is it's important to seek treatment and have therapy and medication and relaxation, but it's really important to connect with others and to actually feel like you're not alone and that, struggle and pain is actually universal.
Would you suggest that people join support groups and things like that?
Absolutely. That's one of the reasons why I started support group meetings in Hong Kong about 5 years ago. When I went through my anxiety disorder, as I mentioned, there was nothing here. And I went to get treatment in the form of CBT and exposure response therapy as well, which really worked. And I wanted to have a place where people who were suffering could come in and they could feel safe and feel that they were not being judged for what they were going through. And they could share their experiences with others who would have some understanding of what they were going through.
Often, if you've never had anxiety, then you don't really know what somebody's going through until you have it. I'd never, ever had it until last year when I was teaching, writing a book and podcasting and doing all of that at once and in menopause. And it tipped me into anxiety. And so I experienced it for about a year. It was just like, oh, now I get it. Now I understand how it affects you physically. It felt for me like someone was standing on my chest, like I was off having tests for lung issues and heart issues because I didn't recognize it as anxiety. And then after a while, first of all, I alleviated my schedule and changed things in my life and got support and been able to overcome it. But it's really good for me now as a teacher working with kids with anxiety that I have a better understanding of what they've gone through. So I think then having support groups with people who know what you're experiencing must be incredibly empowering and help towards your healing.
Absolutely. I mean, thank you for sharing your experience. It's
you're
only
welcome.
through talking
That's
about
what I do
it.
on this podcast. Everyone knows the ins and outs of my menopause and my age and my weight and my everything.
I think having a lot on your plate can be enough to alter the chemicals in our brain, which we need to be balanced in order to feel happy and to feel good. It squashes the serotonin in our brains. And when we add hormones to that as well, that complicates the equation even more. So well done for working through that. And yes, in terms of the support group meeting, actually having other people in there with you makes you feel like you're not alone. Hearing their stories about how they faced challenges or got through an afternoon of panic attacks gives you hope to try again. And having a community where you can come back to and share and cry with and laugh with again makes you feel connected when you feel disconnected when you have an invisible illness. And what I think I love about the support group meeting that I run is there are members who've been coming every month for 5 years who actually don't need to come anymore because they really know how to work with their minds and they're practicing the tools that I've shared with them. But every time they come, they say they learn things in a different light and they look at things differently. And they are so kind to the newcomers who come in and they're scared and they're crying or they may not share or struggling with social anxiety and we can't say anymore. And the older members take them under their wings and say, we've been there. Don't worry. We cried for 6 sessions before we actually spoke up. We had social anxiety for 2 years. And in this group, we started to learn how to actually just say a few things and have support. That's what makes a support group meeting so beautiful. And I really enjoy my time at the meetings.
Isn't that lovely that people are staying on in a mentoring role and then offering support to the people that are coming in new? That's absolutely brilliant. I'm sure that all of us giving back to society or helping others can really help us feel better about ourselves. Like gratitude and charity work and things like that are great tools for feeling better and for your well-being. What are some of the other tools that you recommend for your clients for anxiety in particular?
I think it's really important to cultivate a good morning routine. I think anxiety is the worst at night, and in the morning when you wake up, your cortisol levels are extremely high, your stress hormones. So it's important at that time.
When you wake up?
Yeah, so your cortisol levels are very high in the day, and your melatonin, the sleep hormone chemicals, are low in the day. And as the day progresses, your cortisol levels are supposed to go down and your melatonin levels are supposed to go up to prepare you for sleep. Now, we know work-life balance in Hong Kong is totally skewed. So these cortisol levels actually stay high and our melatonin levels don't actually go up. So people are having problems with sleep because their hormones are not where they should be and their stress hormones are still high. So in the morning, I recommend the first thing to do when you're struggling with anxiety is to get out of bed, no matter how hard it is. Stretch or jump up 10 times, and that just awakens your limbic system, actually gets your body moving. And as soon as you move, it starts to untangle some of the stress and the anxiety. If you stay in bed, you start to ruminate. The what ifs start to play, and then getting out of bed becomes so daunting. I'd also then say going straight in for your shower. And when you're in there having a shower, listening to something that's uplifting, something like Louise Hay with positive affirmations, reminding you of how great you are, or listening to inspiring music that makes you feel good.
Or singing.
Yes. If it's too hard at that time to concentrate and the thoughts still continue to play, to stop and be mindful, to get under the water and think about what is the temperature of this water? Where is the water hitting me on my body? How does it feel? What does my soap smell like? What's the first part of the body that I'm actually going to clean down? Bring yourself into present moment awareness. And when you're in the here and now, it's very hard to be thinking about all the things you haven't done in the past and all the things you have to do. With anxiety, it's important to fuel your body. So you're having regular meals throughout the day. You're snacking to keep your blood sugar high so you're able to think clearly, to make sure you have breaks during the day, not just active breaks, but passive breaks too. In your active breaks, doing a yoga stretch, actually breathing, walking over to get a glass of water from the pantry. And the passive breaks, again, could be reading something inspirational, sending a message to somebody. It's important to cultivate kindness. I think when we're struggling with anxiety, depression, OCD, we are actually our worst enemies. We actually are so mean to ourselves. And we say things like, Why can't I get over this? What's wrong with me? I've only been able to do 2 things on my to-do list. I'm struggling with anxiety and my mate is not, and she's conquering the world, doing all these great things. And I'm so feeble, I can't do anything with myself. And all that negative self-talk actually makes the stress response exasperate and we feel even worse. So I often say, what would you say to your best friend? If she said she's feeling really anxious about something, you say, stop, give yourself a hug. Look at how far you've come today. Look at all the things that you have done.
Focus on the positives.
Yeah, and it doesn't matter how small that is. If you wake up, have a shower, eat your breakfast, and say one thing you're grateful for, and you go back to bed, that's still a really good attempt of the day. We need to try moving forward.
That's such good advice. I think that self-care is a real key to dealing with any kind of mental health issue, isn't it? It's really the first place people should start. And if that doesn't get better, they should seek help and seek treatment. Why do you think there's such a stigma associated with people seeking treatment for mental health issues?
I think there's stigma against mental illness across the globe. I think it's a lot worse in the East, especially in Asia.
Is that because culturally these things aren't really talked about? There's a kind of a shame associated with them?
Yes, I think there's a lot of denial that mental illness even exists in the first place. So when I've spoken to parents or patients who are Asian, a lot of the times they say, is this real? Or am I just being lazy? Should I just pray more? Am I not trying hard enough? And a lot of parents will come to me and say, my son and daughter have developed this because they haven't prayed to the right gods or haven't followed the right rituals or superstitions. I think that's one thing. The second thing is saying that you are struggling with your mental health is kind of admitting that you have a weakness. And that brings a lot of shame and a loss of faith to families. And families, I think especially Asian families, like to wear a mask, that everything's okay, everything is perfect, we hide emotions, we don't talk about them. Emotions are bad, let's put a smile on our face, dress up, pretend nothing is going on. I think that is always the way that it's been dealt with. So that's what parents continue to pass on their children through no fault of their own. I think the way around it is to start to educate people about what mental illness really is. The fact that 1 in 4 people suffer from mental health disorders. The fact that a mental illness is no different from a physical illness. And that is really key. Just because one is invisible and another one is visible, there is no need for the discrimination.
That's exactly the analogy that I use with parents of students when I'm trying to help them get support. If their child had diabetes, you would go and get the support and take what's recommended, whether it be therapy or same with a broken arm or any illness. It is exactly the same. I think it's something to do with the fact you can kind of see most physical illnesses, but you can't see a mental illness. So people then don't give it the sort of kudos or gravitas that it really does deserve. Do you agree with that?
I do agree with that. And it makes me really sad. Somebody asked me the other day, would you choose to have a physical illness or a mental illness if you had a choice?
What did you say?
And I said, it really depends on what physical illness or what mental illness you give me. If you ask me to have cancer, or if you ask me to have a manageable anxiety disorder, I would choose the anxiety disorder because I know there is successful treatment through challenging the thoughts that I have, through exposure response prevention, through medication, through support groups. With cancer, there is treatment, but the success rate, depending on the type of cancer, is hard
Guaranteed.
to predict.
Yeah.
It's a very difficult one to answer. Going back to your stigma question, I think the reason why there's so much stigma is people believe that you have a choice in your mental illness. They believe you've chosen somehow to struggle with depression because you haven't gotten your act together. because you should be trying hard enough.
It comes back to that judgment.
Right. That you should be thinking positively, that you should be changing your attitude towards things. And with anxiety, well, you're just worrying too much. Chill out. And the person with anxiety says, well, if it was that easy, I would have done it already. I think it's important for people to understand that when one struggles with a mental health disorder, it's actually got a biological origin. So it's actually a dysfunction of the brain that causes negative thinking, changes in behavior, emotional responses. So when people say, actually, this is all in your mind, I say, it actually stems from the brain. So if you say there's a physical origin and there's a problem with the brain, people find it harder then to judge or say you've got no basis for saying this is real because you're pointing to biology.
Yes, because if you had a problem with your kidney or your liver, people would be totally accepting of that, wouldn't they? Yeah, it's so interesting. Do you think that mental health issues can be either innate or situational, depending on your family background, your genetics, or what's going on in your life?
I think there are many different causes of mental illness. One is you could have a predisposition towards developing a mental illness if you have a family history of a mental health disorder. So you may have the gene, but it may not necessarily mean that you will develop a mental illness unless you are confronted with a high level of stress or trauma in your lifetime and you're not able to handle it. You don't have a support system in place and you don't have the skills to cope. And that fight or flight response goes into overactivation and your serotonin levels, your happy chemical, get totally depleted, and bang, that switch flips and you develop a mental health disorder. So yes, chemical imbalances, nature has a huge part to play with it, but also your environment. If you have a parent who continuously checks doors and checks windows and is scared that intruders will come in at night, and you see your parent doing this every night from a young age, you are going to develop that same behavior, that same pattern of thinking until you're questioned about it. So it can also be a learned behavior.
So interesting. I read on your website about some of the different therapies that you do. What's acceptance commitment therapy and how does it work?
Acceptance commitment therapy uses a lot of mindfulness as part of treating a mental health disorder. So with cognitive behavior therapy, you look at the thoughts that you have, such as, I'm a failure, and you challenge them. And you say, well, what evidence do you have to suggest that you're a failure? And you go through them trying to dispute that theory. With acceptance commitment therapy, you accept the thoughts that you have. By acceptance, I don't mean agreeing with them. You accept them and you say, this is a thought that I'm having. That's interesting. Now, where does this thought actually sit in my body? Where do I feel it? Why do I actually feel this thought that I'm actually a failure? And instead of challenging it, you see it as a thought that's background noise, that's coming like a cloud that you can see in the sky, and it's just drifting past, and you don't get stuck on that thought. And you say, okay, well, let me focus my attention back onto what I'm doing right now. I've got an essay that I need to get done tomorrow. What are the things that I have to do? And then you have the thought again, oh, I'm a failure. It's continuously bringing yourself back into the present moment, acknowledging the thought that you have, and using mindfulness techniques to help to distance yourself from that thought. So, for example, I will give some of my patients an analogy of being a passenger on a bus. And there's a driver, and the driver is driving a big bus to, let's say, Central. And there are all these passengers on the bus who are saying, no, don't go that way. You should be going through Magazine Gap Road, not through Queen's Road. And there's another one saying, oh, you're such a terrible driver. Can you drive slower? This is not safe. And then there's another one that's saying, I really need to get to this meeting. Can you drive faster? And if that driver listens to every single one of those thoughts, he is not going to get anybody to Central. he's going to crash the vehicle. So we have a choice on which thoughts we want to listen to. And at that time, that driver has to say, thank you. I hear those thoughts. Those thoughts are like the comments from the passenger, but I'm choosing to focus on where I'm going right now. And it doesn't mean that you're not going to have an emotional charge, because you may feel frustrated at the people who are saying those things to you. You may feel anxious, and at that moment, to breathe, to maybe look at a photo that calms you down and continue with a task at hand.
Oh, that's a really good analogy. I love it. That's great. That makes complete sense. Now, I'm going to ask you about another type of therapy, but I want to guess what it is, okay? First. I wonder what mindfulness-based compassion is and how it works. And I want to have a guess at this. I haven't researched it, but I imagine that it's about, in your mindfulness practice, being compassionate to yourself and getting rid of that negative self-talk and almost playing the opposite game, which is something that I do with students, where if they're having a negative thought, I make them try and come up with the opposite thought and tell me what that is and use that as a way to try and change their way of thinking. Am I anywhere close?
Absolutely. I think you should come and work with me, Jules.
Brilliant. I'm hired. Awesome. Is that what it is?
Yes, I think there's a lot of merit in mindfulness-based compassion, not just for those who are struggling with mental health disorders, but for everybody, to actually stop and pause and reflect on the thoughts that they're having and their emotional response to those thoughts and how those thoughts make them feel. And any thought that's actually causing a disturbance of peace or a unpleasant emotion should be one should try and look at them with eyes of compassion and love and kindness. Love and kindness meditations go hand in hand with mindfulness-based compassion, bringing love and kindness to yourself for what you're going through at this time. So as opposed to saying, I haven't done anything today, going and writing down the 3 things that you did do and giving yourself some sort of reward, whether it's that cup of tea, that piece of chocolate, watching an episode of Friends. Sorry, I still go to Friends.
I love Friends. I got sick and I just watched the whole lot. It was brilliant.
The best.
Yeah,
it's
great.
Feel good.
It is. It's hilarious. I absolutely love it. Yeah, it's so much fun.
Yeah. Mindfulness-based compassion helps to bring love and kindness back into your system, and it helps to activate the relaxation response.
Self-compassion is so important. We're so judgmental of ourselves. As you were saying earlier, would you speak to a friend the way you speak to yourself? Most people, whether they have a mental health issue or not, can often be hard on themselves and often don't have that negative self-talk or judge themselves or focus on the aspects of themselves internally or externally that they don't like. And to be really fulfilled and happy, forget all of that. Give to others, work with charities, make a difference in people's lives, do things that you love, be creative. I think that's such a good message to give to our listeners, isn't it?
Absolutely. I think it's really important to talk and to be able to identify when our inner critic goes to work. And we need to start to recognize at that time whether or not we choose to focus on those thoughts that lead us down to a downward spiral or choose more uplifting thoughts. I actually, with a lot of my clients, get them to draw what their inner critic looks like and give it a name. So my inner critic's name is Malusha.
Great name.
So when I start to say, oh, I'm not good enough, I really didn't do that well, I've made so many mistakes, I haven't been able to see enough clients, my partner will say to me, is that Minal speaking or is that Malusha? If it's Malusha, I don't really care what she's saying because she's lying. But if it's Minal, let's talk about it. And I think it's really important to be able to give your inner critic another name or another face and identity so you realize it's not you.
So much about that inner critic is acceptance, isn't it? We can't accept that our bodies change, or we can't accept that we're aging, or we can't accept that we failed at something, because everybody fails at something. It's okay. It's actually character building. You can learn a lot more about yourself and life from your failures than your successes. But many of us can't accept these factors. And I think that really is the sort of cornerstone of overcoming that self-critic and that negative self-talk, is starting to accept. Do you agree?
I agree. And I think with things like failure, I think those limiting beliefs, those core beliefs come from some sort of traumatic experience when one is younger, whether it is a parent saying you're a failure or whether it's a teacher who said you failed and you did really badly in class. And then that person grows up and remembers that voice. And so everything that they do, every small mistake that they make, it reinforces the core belief of I'm a failure. And it's important to go back and think about when did that start? And is that really true? And how can we be so critical and judgmental to ourselves?
Exactly. What would you say to somebody who's suffering from any kind of debilitating mental health issue and they're unable to reach out for support?
I would say to them that I have great admiration for them, that they continue to get through each day. That I know that it's not easy and they feel a whole array of different emotions. I would reassure them and tell them there is hope, that they're not alone, that the recovery rate of actually getting through a mental health disorder, especially when you intervene early, is high. And there are people out there who can help. And if they find it hard to actually speak to a professional, maybe start by just speaking to a friend, a parent, a loved one who they can trust and say, I'm not doing well, and let that person navigate and help to get them the right support.
That's a really good idea. Also, there are helplines in most countries. Like we've got the Samaritan's hotline here in Hong Kong, and I'll put that number in the show notes. But there are crisis lines and helplines in most countries around the world. So people could start with a conversation on the phone with somebody as well, couldn't they?
Absolutely. And if talking is too hard, there's also opportunities to write how you feel as well. If you need to express through text messaging or WhatsApp, I know there are a few groups like that here in Hong Kong for youth where you can WhatsApp your feelings. I think the world of today, picking up the phone is something that's foreign.
Very old fashioned. Look, I'm showing my age. Okay. Text somebody.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And tell them how you're feeling.
Yeah, that's good advice as well.
And I think more people than not would be willing to listen and to help. And more people than we think have actually suffered from or are suffering from mental illness. Again, it's 1 in 4 people. It's 13.3% in Hong Kong of people who suffer from mental illness with anxiety.
That's high percent.
Yeah, with anxiety and depression being the highest. Although I think that this figure is severely understated.
Because people don't report it.
People don't report it because of the stigma, fear that they're going to lose their job, fear they're going to be found out in some way. And also because they really don't know what it is.
Exactly. How do you raise awareness within the community about mental health issues?
Really big part of what we do is raising awareness and dispelling stigma. And the time that we do that most is in October. October is World Mental Health Day. That's October the 10th. And it's also that week, the beginning of October, there is OCD Awareness Week and World Mental Health Awareness Week. So at that time, I go into Central with a bunch of volunteers and we distribute green ribbons to people in the community. And those green ribbons represent us seeing the struggle of those who are suffering from mental illness. And it's a symbol of hope and strength and encouragement for those who are going through these difficulties.
And you're opening up the conversation about mental health as well, which is so important, isn't it?
Absolutely. I work at that time closely with schools and talk about the importance of mental health education and go in and give seminars or workshops on anxiety and depression, go into clinics and hospitals as well and do stress management training. It's all about boosting mental health education so people are able to recognize what the common mental health disorders are, identify the signs and symptoms, and actually have some tools to cope with those challenges in themselves, and also some skill with approaching others and assisting them when they're struggling with mental health disorders. I also run anti-stigma campaigns. I'm in the process of developing a stigma campaign for this year, We have just become a charity. We've been a nonprofit for the last 5 years. From this year, we are going to start collecting donations, and we're reaching out to schools to get them to ask their children and their students to wear green on October the 10th, and we will give them green ribbons to try and raise awareness. We really just want to give people a voice and a platform to express how they feel in a supportive environment. And our hope is through raising awareness, people will feel less scared to come out with what they're going through. And they realize that they didn't have to hide it for so long.
In an ideal world, in the future, what would you like to see for mental health?
I think the most important thing is acceptance and non-judgment for those who are suffering from mental illness. I would like people to see and treat mental illness in the same way that they treat physical illness. I would like the stigma against mental health to be dispelled. And in Hong Kong, I would like there to be a lot more collaboration between the different mental health charities and local NGOs that work with those who suffer from mental illness. Because I think everybody's doing a great job on their own, but I think together, the power of community is very inspiring and very empowering, and there's so much more that we can do together.
That is so true. Finally, Minal, to finish up, how can people help others make a difference about mental health?
I think it's really important that everybody feels that they can support others who are struggling with mental illness. Support comes in the form of listening and communicating without judgment. So somebody who speaks to you about what they're going through, it's important to say, I hear you. I may not understand what you're going through, but we can get you the help that you need. I hear that this is very scary for you, very difficult for you. Communicate in a way that's gentle. It's important as well to give support in the form of information to those who are struggling with mental illness because they may not know where to turn. So give them resources that they can go check out or help them in terms of bringing them to an appointment, being with them. It's important to encourage them to talk about what they're going through to people who they trust, because talking about it can help ease their burden. It's important, like I said, to check in with those who are suffering with any sort of emotional distress. It doesn't have to be a mental health disorder. And just saying, thinking of you, are you okay? Sending you love and light. I do that a lot. When you're ready to talk, I'm here. And not having hostility towards people if they fall off the planet and they haven't been in touch for a while. It might be because they're going through a lot. I think us as human beings take things so personally. And when people don't respond, we think, what's wrong with me? Do they not like me? Why don't they have time? I saw they were doing something the other day with work. Surely they have time.
And that brings us to the digital age and social media and WhatsApp and text messaging and all of that. We start to feel like we want an immediate response, and you don't know what people are doing or whether they can respond. So let it go.
I think it's important to encourage and praise even the smallest of steps. So when I have clients or even friends who say, struggling to get out of bed today, it's just one of those days. I say, okay, how can I support you? What is it that you need? Because they may just need, can you text me in an hour to make sure that I'm okay? Another person might say, I actually need you to physically come over. Another person might say, I need your voice. I need you on the phone. Another person might say, I need you to hug me or contact someone who can be with me. So it's important to understand that everybody's needs are different too, and that we're here to just support others.
That's such a lovely message to finish on. Minal, how can people get in touch with you if they'd like to be a client of yours or get more information on your OCD and anxiety support group?
We have a website. It's www.ocdanxietyhk.org. On the website, you'll find information about World Mental Health Day, the Green Ribbon Campaign, support group meetings, educational material on OCD and anxiety disorders, and information on upcoming trainings or workshops that we are delivering. If you'd like to inquire about consultation or booking in a session with me, you can email me on ocdcommunityhk@gmail.com. And I'd just like to say that it's really important to know that if you are suffering from a mental health disorder, that you are not alone, that you did not choose it. There is nothing to be ashamed of, and there is light at the end of the tunnel.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Minal, for being here today. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. And I think this podcast is going to be super helpful for a lot of people. And I hope that anyone out there who's listening, if you're feeling like you need support, please reach out and get it.
Thank you.
If any of you feel that this is a podcast that your friends or family might benefit from listening to, please could you share it with them? Please could you go to iTunes to rate and review us, because that'll be amazing. If you would like to sponsor this podcast, I have a page on Patreon. You can go to Patreon and look for Hong Kong Confidential, and you could even just give me $1 a month. That will get you some rewards, and it will also help fund this podcast so we can get these amazing messages out like we have with Minal today. Thanks again, Minal. It's been an absolute pleasure, and keep up the great work.
Thank you, Jules, and thank you to all the listeners.
Yeah, thanks, listeners. I love yous all. Bye. Hong Kong Confidential is brought to you by Teresa's Turkish Towels. Teresa imports the finest 100% Turkish cotton towels that dry very quickly, making them perfect for Hong Kong's humid climate. Say goodbye to the traditional smelly and stinky towels and try the colourful and fresh selections available online or in Teresa's Wan Chai store. Use the promo code CONFIDENTIAL online or mention this podcast when you visit in person to receive $100 off your entire order when you order 2 or more towels. With 100% satisfaction guaranteed or your money back, the only thing you've got to lose are the musty smells that permeate traditional terry towels. Visit www.hkturkish.com in order to get the address and directions to Teresa's semi-hidden location. So that brings us to the end of another Hong Kong Confidential podcast. I'm Jules Hannaford. Thanks for joining me, and I hope you'll be with me again next week. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please can you go to iTunes to rate and review it. I would really appreciate your feedback. You can email me at jules@hongkongconfidential.net, and you can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Hong Kong Confidential. If you'd like to hit me up on Twitter, it's at Jules Hannaford. I would love to hear from you.
Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.